Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia. Let's talk books. Today I'm here to talk about a book that I just finished reading. It's an older one, but one that I had seen recommended by several historians and I hadn't yet read it. So I needed to read Confederates in the Attic by Tony Horwitz. So this is a book that Tony Horwitz what Tony Horwitz did was go through the American South, examining the memory of the Civil War and how people remember and commemorate the Civil War in both positive and negative ways. If you liked How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith, you're gonna like this book. They're very similar, but also different enough. The approaches of the authors are different enough that I think it's worth it to read both books. So, one of the things that struck me about this book as worth mentioning is that Tony Horwitz did this kind of tour of the memory of the Civil War in the 1990s. At one point, he mentions President Clinton, and I was just like, "Wait, this was took place in the 90s," and it just really struck me about how little has changed in kind of the conflicts within American society, especially revolving around the Civil War. It is just really interesting, at times incredibly painful and disheartening, but I think Horwitz also manages to put in a little bit of optimism, especially towards the end, that I'm not sure if it's like completely warranted, right? I think, but that probably just depends on your approach to this material. So, a lot of what we see over and over again in the people that Horwitz interviews is how much they feel a connection to the Civil War, and most of it they feel in a very positive, or well, at times can be positive and empowering way for individuals, but it can also be a really negative, right? This attachment to the lost cause, this idea that the South was severely and unduly punished for having lost the war by the North, and that the punishment exceeded what needed to occur, right? That the North came in and burned down the South, destroyed its society and its people, and imposed laws and a new way of life in the South. That is very much still alive today, especially if you've read Clint Smith's book. It is very obvious if you've paid any even a little bit of attention to the kinds of discussions that are happening in American political life today. I think it is clear that it's the same themes coming up again, most recently. And one of the things that struck me when I was explaining to my husband what I was reading when he asked about this book was how much like Trump is not a new thing. And in fact, Trump did not create the kind of racial tension and the rise of violence against marginalized people and racism in this country. In fact, more when you read this book, I think it becomes much more clear that Trump was created by a lot of the resentment that already existed, especially around the topics of race and marginalized people, and the place of marginalized people in American life and society. So the other thing in this book that is really clear that Horwitz makes a point to emphasize a lot is the diversity in the people that are or were in the 90s obsessed with the Civil War, people that do reenactments, that visit the war sites, that work in these places. Some of them are clearly have this attachment to the lost cause, but other people don't really seem to have that same kind of feeling towards it. They don't idolize the Confederacy in the same way as others. For example, Horwitz spends a lot of time with a Civil War reenactor, Robert Hodge, who is a diehard. He goes as far as like spending the night at Civil War battle fields. He dyes the clothes in the same way that they would have been dyed in the 1860s. He tries to eat the same kind of food. He's a hardcore reenactor. He's not a casual reenactor, and he spends quite a bit of time with him. And Hodge is not somebody who is uh, deeply racist or like attached to right-wing politics. No, that he's just has this emotional obsession and connection to the Civil War, and it's a hobby, more than a hobby actually. It's a religion for Hodge and other reenactors like him and other people that are kind of obsessed with that history. So it's an obsession with the history, not to this lost cause imagery of the Civil War, which I found really interesting. And on that topic, I think chapter 8 of this book really emphasizes a lot of the memory aspects. If you have read any memory studies at all, it's really there. It's really fascinating, kind of academic field, the history of memory. And there's the chapter 8 in particular, I think, really speaks to the way in which memory is created and the importance of place for a lot of people in recreating remembering history of the Civil War. Chapter 8 focuses on a particular battle and a particular reenactment of it, and it's a lot about how the reenactors really try to look at old maps and figure out plays and the complications of trying to figure out exactly where something happened, exactly where soldiers were located and their movements and all of that. It is really extraordinary. I did some of this. I read a bit on the history of memory as a graduate student, and this chapter just stood out as magnificent for exploring the connection between place and memory. There's also just a bunch of really wacky things that come up. For example, he talks at one point to a Scarlett O'Hara kind of an actress that takes on the role of Scarlett O'Hara, especially for like Confederate organizations, like organizations that do reenactments and commemoration of the Civil War, but also for Japanese tourists. It turns out that at least in the 90s, there was a kind of fascination in Japan with the movie Gone with the Wind, and especially with the Confederate South. So that was really interesting and something that I had no clue about. He also explores the conflict between the history that is remembered, how it's remembered, and then the truth. There are times where, he spends a lot of time, sometimes days, weeks, on exploring a person or a location, something like that, and then ends up spending the second half of the chapter basically telling us about how all of it, everything he just experienced, is actually historically wrong. And again, really fascinating for really digging into those aspects of how memory is not the same thing as history, in terms of, okay, the reality of what things happen and how we interpret it, how we commemorate them, how we remember that history, how we write that history in both academic and popular ways. So it was just a really fascinating read, really long at times, heartbreaking in others. For example, he spends a chapter discussing an incident that happened in, is it in Tennessee? I think it's either in Tennessee or in Kentucky, where somebody is killed. A white man is killed for flying the Confederate flag, and he's killed by a black teenager. You can imagine the kind of politics that followed that incident and the effect it had on that community. It is absolutely heartbreaking. He also goes into other communities that are debating whether the Confederate flag should continue to fly, and the kind of conflict that leads to in these communities. And some of that is really heartbreaking because we see how little things have changed, and the kinds of racism that pops up even when people are claiming that their attachment to the Confederate battle flag is an emotional or historical one, not a race-based one. Another really important theme quickly is that theme of racism. It pops up not just in terms of racism towards black people, that a lot of these white individuals who are obsessed with the Civil War are expressing, but also anti-Semitism. There are a couple of instances that really stood out to me in which he's encountering people that are clearly anti-Semitic, and they're not all white. There is one black person that is clearly like anti-Semitic, and Horwitz was Jewish, and he a couple of times actually comes out and tells these people, well, I'm Jewish, and their reaction, what they do with that, what Horwitz does with that, you know, when he chooses to let people know that he's Jewish when they're going off on an anti-Semitic rant, and when he doesn't, is really interesting how he deals with that as a kind of reporter and writer is really interesting as well. So that was just a quick highlight of some of the themes that stood out to me in this book. I think if you're interested at all, I think it's worth picking up. It is a long book, so you want to take your time with it, and also because it's dealing with a lot of difficult material. I recommend taking your time with it, not do what I did, which was kind of plow through it. I wanted to read it in preparation for teaching a U.S. history course, so I was just kind of plowing through it. But I want to point out that the way I read as a professor, as someone who's going to be teaching some of this history, is different than the way I think people who are not reading with that purpose, reading nonfiction with that purpose, will read it. And so I'm always like looking for particular ways in which I might change the way I'm teaching something, readings I could add, where I could add them, in what classes, things like that. So I know that my reading of this book in particular might be different than other people. So take that information in as you've been watching my video. I want to be clear about that. But yeah, if you've read this book, if you're interested at all, please let me know down in the comments section. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.